Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and community organizer and socialist Kenny Cepeda. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, and share your favorite episode. Turn on your notifications wherever you found this episode. Thank you. That was my nephew in the background.
Wonderful. He's excited about Biden the Biden inauguration.
Yes. Today is Wednesday, as we are recording this, and it is an inauguration of a U.S. president here in Gringolandia, the USA. The ceremony that is the commencement of a new four-year term of president. And we thought we would discuss what does the inauguration possibly mean for any of us, and as well as the recent affairs that have gone out in Washington D.C. with seeing the military at the Capitol and sort of reminiscence of some of maybe the scenes we've seen in other countries as the U.S. has meddled in other countries, and anything around Biden and how we should really look at his legacy as not to ignore that legacy that has been left behind.
And you were saying you were very struck by these pictures you'd seen either both prior to the inauguration and I haven't really watched too much around the inauguration, but of the soldiers like sleeping in the hallways, and I think there's like 26,000 National Guard or 24,000 National Guard from all across the country stationed now in D.C. You had strong feelings about that.
Yeah, I did. I'll read what Venezuelan's President Nicolas Maduro said. This is how I feel about it. Well, he said this on the 6th of January after there were the protesters that had entered the Capitol. But it's linked to what I feel now with the response. And he said that the Venezuelan government expresses its concern with the acts of violence that are taking place in the city of Washington, the United States. And he mirrored the language used by U.S. officials commenting on political movements in foreign countries. Venezuela condemned the violence, and this is what Venezuela said. Venezuela condemns the political polarization and the spiral of violence that only reflects the deep crisis that the political and social system of the USA is currently going through. And with this unfortunate episode, the United States is suffering the same thing that it has generated in other countries with its policies of aggression. Venezuela hopes that soon the violence will cease and the American people can finally open a new path towards stability and social justice. This was sort of, I felt as if it was mocking a lot of the statements that come forth from U.S. correspondents in foreign countries or diplomatic messages that are given in press releases that they release out, talking about Uganda's president or talking about Latin American countries or the instability in the Middle East. It is the hypocrisy of it. And I thought, just looking at images, I sent you both. I posted on my own social media where I posted that if anyone was just to search images of the U.S. Of Washington D.C. right now, you'd see the military sleeping within the Capitol. You'd see the military surrounding U.S. government sites, and everyone is suddenly weirded out by it. But this has been going on for so long in other countries. And right now, there were a few of the countries that were sending out traveler notices. When I travel, sometimes I look at, sometimes just out of curiosity, how the USA portrays a certain country, and they have their travel notices and how dangerous a country is. and what we should look out for. And now Turkey and Venezuela have put out, and other countries I forget right now, have put out travel notices about the USA. Be careful when you travel there. Don't hang around large crowds, or it's known for violence. It's very interesting. And I was just telling you both that I was looking for this BBC podcast transcript of this great person who was talking about the USA and its current state. But it mirrors the language, and I think we shouldn't forget how in just very recently the U.S. has a long history of supporting regime change efforts, usually violent, in Latin America. I mean, it was just in 2020. Was it just this during the presidential year of Trump, where there have been attempts to displace Maduro with Guaido, and we did an episode on that. But we can go back throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, when the USA attempted to fight the spread of revolutionary socialist government in Latin America by supporting, training, and supplying violent reactionary insurgents. That's the history of it. So we have the Contras in Nicaragua, and opposing the Marxist Sandinistas, fueled by the USA. And we have as well the meddling in the Middle East, of course. And I just think it's always interesting when the USA's reaction is this way. It comes home. It's when it's home that it feels real to a lot of people. But it is a hypocritical, I think, stance or position to be in, when this is what it has always been like or felt like for many other countries and other places. So I'll just leave it there. And I think maybe you both can contribute. We've already just touched on this on previous episodes.
So, as Alison McDowell said, I'm a recovering liberal too. In 2008, I actually got tickets to go to Obama's inauguration. I was in Washington. That was my first time ever being in in D.C. And obviously Obama's inauguration was massive, and there was a pageantry, around, like who would go to the inaugural balls, who had access, because like one of my friends was doing a internship with a congressman from I don't know where, and so I had kind of at that time I wanted to be part of politics prior going to that, and then I saw that, and it was like a high school thing going on. My point is that the day of inauguration, or the prior to that, there was a massive display of military. You don't see that shit on TV. That shit is always there during the inauguration time. So I'm not denying that maybe there is a more robust like display now, but it's deliberate. The fact that they're showing you those images are deliberate. They displays into their game. That the whole orchestration of, January 6th it was, right?
Yeah.
That in a prior episode, at least I was saying that it's, it feels orchestrated. It was maneuvering from the political class mafia. It's a coordinated, move to throw one of their members, who's relatively an outsider, throw him under the bus to kind of clean their hands. And so again, my first point is that the military presence in Washington is not new. It also brings up questions, right, as to why a group of ragtag people are able to break into Congress when, in people that are defending the most powerful people in this world, with handguns and non-machine guns, right? And those images circulating like, hot bread, in every major media. And so my point is there's always military presence. I saw tanks. I saw war machinery on the streets of Washington in 2008 when Obama's first inauguration, and then, they had a tight security and control over that. And even after that, when roaming around the streets, you see there is security. The other thing now is that I do think what happened today at the inauguration is regime change in a way, but it was hand selected, you know, uh, representatives of the mafia that we're speaking of, two people that are proven, with blood in their hands, enforcers of the mafia, and enforcers of the state violence on the working class, especially the people of color. Um, and so, and actually, once if you see the full picture of what has transcurred in the last 10 days or so, no more, like 2 weeks. It feels very familiar. It feels like this is all the shit they pull in other countries. Like if you know any history of regime change in Latin America, you know this is what they do. Like they involve the military, they involve some chaotic scenes, to delegitimize some politician and install who they want to be and rally behind them and give legitimacy to those new representatives, of the political class or whatever. So I do think we saw a change of regime, not in the sense that the real people who govern are not those people in the Oval Office. In my mind, is the people that put them there. Is the people that can squeeze them and maneuver them. And these people who get the image, who get displayed to the world, they're really the in charge of executing the will of the ruling class, the capitalist ruling class, ultimately.
Yeah, and I agree with what Kenny said, that in a sense that today is a continuation of the theater that has been going on for a while, of the chaos around the election, and then that culminated in January 6th. Talk about that as a coup or an insurrection. Again, this a made up narrative, and now all these troops who are present now in a particular way, to indicate that that there is a regime that's in some ways the democracy is under threat, and our troops and our officials who are about to be installed today are here to preserve it and make sure that democracy goes on. When in fact it was a sham election. I think it was a fake election. I think the wrong guy won. Like, not wrong in terms of right or wrong. I don't believe the popular vote. I don't believe the election was legitimate. I think it was a fake election, not just in terms of the fraud of the U.S. elections in general, but I don't believe the count. And that's now, that saying that is now something you're not allowed to say in this country any longer, because you're now dangerous by virtue of that. And I'll talk about that more later. Because these soldiers were there to preserve the notion that people should be afraid of their democracy, and that it's these forces of the Democrats and the Republicans uniting. The establishment's going to come together, along with, of course, our U.S. soldiers and our police, right? Who were before it was all defund police. Now let's keep the police intact for order and to preserve our democratic institutions. So this is what is going to go forward now. And at the same time, it's while Maduro might be talking about it and like trying to like kind of make fun of the United States for saying it's unstable, I don't think he quite gets the fact that that actually is what the U.S. is attempting to say, or the U.S. state, so that now it's going to crack down in order to tamp down that instability. And it's not even instability that exists. The ruling class is very strong right now in the United States. There's no resistance in this country. When we talk about taking down people in Latin America, there is some instability there. There are street demonstrations. There are people blockading. There's barricades. There are the conditions of actual revolution that the U.S. is either trying to foment, or the U.S. is trying to go in there and help crack down on, one way or the other. That's not the conditions we're facing in this country, unfortunately, actually. And the U.S. had to put a sham in front of it just so it could take its own strength and double down on it. And now it's going to essentially, what they're talking about this coup as sort of the newest 9/11, right? They're talking about doing a 9/11 commission to look at what happened with this coup and insurrection, and are preparing the U.S. population for a crackdown on dissenters, mostly dissenters from the right, people who might, the dangerous people who think that this election was not legitimate. They're equating, in fact, who was it? General McChrystal, okay, was saying, is literally equating these people who they say are kind of right-wing radicals who don't believe the election, who are Trump supporters. These people are like Al Qaeda, right? And John Brennan, former CIA director, connected these people to ISIS, and is talking about people that way. Now, first of all, the war on terror that started under Patriot Act and the attack on ISIS, I have always, and I've said this before, Eduardo, and you've sometimes been uncomfortable when I said ISIS is not the problem, the US state is the problem. And anyone, whether you are on the right or on the left, whoever thought that you were going to get over by supporting the US state in attacking ISIS or attacking Al Qaeda, well, now you're learning a lesson. Now you're learning that that very state is going to come after you. So there's we have to understand that it's a standard thing that the left should have known, is that any strengthening of the state by something like the Patriot Act is not just an attack on Muslims, it's not just an attack on terrorists, it's not an attack on illegal immigrants, it's an attack on us. And we are now seeing that, because that very same language of international terrorism and going after international terrorism, and actually the techniques being used to go after international terrorism, are now going to be brought home directly to go after largely, initially, so-called right-wing targets, white supremacists, Nazis, and dead enders who might not believe the election is, was legitimate and want to do something about it. Like, that's what they're going to say. But as we know, that stuff can be used against the left wing and will be used against the left wing. And all it's going to do is strengthen the state and give it more authority to attack its own people, censor us, be more of a crackdown. So it's today's inauguration was an inauguration of the fake news of our political system, as it sells itself as democratic, and at the very same time lays the groundwork for what is even more authoritarianism than we saw under Donald Trump or Barack Obama. Right? We're going to see more authoritarianism now come from the Democrats and the Republicans as they unite now, this is a very dark day, I would say, and it's going to be a very dangerous time, not for the establishment. They are looking very good right now, but for us. And, if people who are celebrating Biden, I don't know what to tell you.
I agree with a lot of what both of you are saying. My only bringing up this is the whole fact of the army being there and the military. It's for two things. One, just as I already said before, it was just to show and demonstrate that this is something that looks a lot like in other countries, right? And also when the USA meddles in those countries, and also how the USA does talk about how they're exceptional and they're the example of democracy, and we have peaceful transfers of power here. And so this is the point that I am trying to show and make. And I know, Kenny, you said it's been militarized before, or you went to Obama's, but this has been the most militarized since 1861. So this is unprecedented. There has always been the military when there's inauguration ceremonies, but this has been the most militarized since 1861. And that is during the USA Civil War. Mm-hmm. And when I bring this up, it's just to show how the USA isn't the country of freedom and liberty and all the things that it calls in the name of the USA and the US American flag, and trying to attempt to show to the world that we are the exception, we are special, we are trying to lead the country, we are la primera potencia, we are the first, leader, whatever, of the world to lead by example. This country isn't. And I'm in agreement with both of you about, you were stating it, Andy, about what will happen now because of what has transpired in the past 2 weeks, and the last 2 weeks ago, it is that this will now be the most sought after way to seek out any traitors. I mean, they're even calling for vetting. The FBI is vetting the U.S. National Guard if you have different points of view. If you so have a point of view of supporting Trump, if you have, who knows what it would look like if you have dissenting views. Support. I mean, we already know from Reality Winner, one of the surveillance folks that was leaking information to The Intercept, that how she was treated just by having dissenting voice, and she's part of the liberal state, I think, liberal left, and this is just a crackdown. So I'm in agreement with you that this is now seen as almost as the 9/11 attack, but I see hesitancy to call it domestic terrorism. I know that some liberals are trying to label it as that. I fear that that will have repercussions for the rest of us. But the hesitancy, it's almost, there's two ways of thinking here. Some liberals want to call it that, which will have, as I said, repercussions. Others are not wanting to label any form of U.S. terrorism domestic, because that's not how it's thought of as terrorism. It's normally terrorism is something that happens by Muslims and foreign adversaries. Adversaries is the word. Adversaries. This isn't. In my attempt, it's to show people really look at this country for what it is and has always been, and the continuation of its military force, even to its own U.S. citizens. This isn't the ideal country that we make it to be, as people try to portray it.
And I guess what I'm trying to convey is that this notion that there is a political crisis here, because there is none. I think it's like, I agree with Lipson that by and large is the threats to the state, to the monopoly of power and violence, they're non-existent. We are on our knees, and just waiting and actually like celebrating our oppressors, in very nefarious institutions like big pharma, like the military, like, our political class, celebrating them saving some sort of shambles or pretenses of democracy. Also the whole militarization of the U.S. I've my whole life, I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and I traveled a decent amount in Central America, Canada, and I lived in Nicaragua, and and obviously I don't think Ortega is a socialist or that, whatever the hell they call themselves, but when I traveled to Nicaragua, I felt safe. When I came back to the U.S., there was military like everywhere, like heavy, weapons and shit at the airports, in different spaces, not just the military, but the cops, and so there, especially in poor communities, there's zones of occupation. So at least in my lifetime, like this is nothing different. I mean, like, yeah, it's a one-time display, but that's the point. They're doing that for a purpose, and that's what we have to question. And don't fall for like, I think the myth that there is a political crisis in the U.S. or an assault on democratic institutions that have never existed, never been democratic. So I guess I just want to make clear that there is no political crisis in the U.S. On the contrary, they have a tight grip. And we should be scared because when, at least I've heard this before, that, empires go to war to the degree they can control the domestic populations. And we are very much under control here. In COVID is a perfect cover for that, or the era of COVID and new viruses that can be summoned at any time from now on. Our world has changed. This is a 9/11. Our world has changed. They can call that shit at any time, whether you believe this shit is as intense as they claim it or not. The reality is that they can summon this tool to bend the knee of the working class at any moment from now on for the rest of our lives.
I'm not saying that the U.S. ruling class isn't nervous. I mean, I think that overall, part of the reorganization they're making of the working class of society is in relationship to their historic nervousness about revolution, as they continue to take wealth from workers and force it to the top. So that's one area where they are nervous. They've written articles. I've read so many articles from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Economist, basically saying how can we continue to? We might need to worry about continuing to see the separation, the divide between rich and poor grow, because this is what creates revolution. So I know that they know that, and I know that they're nervous about that. So that there's that abstract nervousness, and they are nervous about China and competition with that. That is something that they worry about. Russia to some extent, and maybe even Europe. Although the Biden administration is they're going to try to rebuild the NATO coalition to take on China, and then a little bit take on Russia. But in terms of feeling nervous about their control of the working class here in the United States, like I said, they're in very good shape. They know that by the number of people who wear masks. They know that by the number of people who will be taking a vaccine. They know that by the number of people who will stay out of their schools and say, we're going to keep ourselves safe. We're not going back to our work. We're going to stay out of that. And they know that by the number of people who voted. They know that by the huge numbers of votes for Biden and for Trump. Tell them, oh, good, we've got people with skin in the game. All right, and they know that because after they've spent a year throttling people, the most that even they could have was like a 4,000 person demonstration that they had to kind of literally walk into the Congress in order to make it happen. There's been so much throttling of working people in this country that there should be an insurrection. There should be like hundreds of thousands of people. There should be nervous electors right now, but they're not, unfortunately, because unfortunately right now we are buying virtually every narrative that's out there around COVID, around vaccines, around keeping ourselves separated, and around the Democratic Party being some sort of improvement versus what just happened with Trump. What we are going to see now with this Democratic Party is real power sharing. The McConnell and Schumer met today and basically agreed to do a 50-50 split of all Senate committees. Now the Democrats will have that one extra tilt to it, but the Democrats have really reached across the aisle, to basically say, look, we're going to roll this thing together. And the Democrats who've been talking about the crackdown on the far right, on the Proud Boys and things like that, Republicans have been largely silent because both of them are in on the game. And the left is going to say that the thank you state for cracking down on the white supremacists. Thank you, U.S. state, for cracking down on the Proud Boys and the Nazis, what they're calling Nazis. And we do that. We welcome that. We join in that choir at our own risk, because again, just like ISIS was never the threat, it was always Obama. The Nazis or these fascists, these Proud Boys, are not the threat. It's Biden. It's Kamala Harris who's the threat. It's Silicon Valley. Who's that? It's Forrest. Who's the dude who leads Twitter? What's his name? I can't remember his name. But that Jack Forrester or something like that. It's that guy with the beard and everything like that. Those are the people who are the threats today, and those are the people who we have to be extremely nervous about. The Bill Gates, the various institutions, Koch brothers, all those kind of folks. I don't know if the Koch brothers maybe there's only one Koch brother now, but anyway, that's what I'll say is that this is they've got a very good situation here at home. Unfortunately, it should be a lot worse, but I think we have fallen for a lot of the lies, hook, line, and sinker. So I remember that guy's name. I'm going to probably say it here because I might add it in. It's Jack Dorsey, the head of Twitter.
I think this is where we're moving into Biden now. As we're talking, I see this as you were speaking. I could see how the conversation is. The second part of what we were going to talk about was this notion that the Democrats are going to that the left puts all of their eggs in this one basket of this leader, and they hold their nose for him. I did not vote for Biden this time around. I voted for someone else. I voted for Gloria La Riva, socialist, and whether that is effective or not, it's a different conversation. But many people did, and they still think that this is the best choice we have, instead of having had another 4 years of Trump. And as people are rejoicing, did we have this conversation, Andy, online or offline? I forget, but I do align myself with Democrats, and I have voted for Democrats, but I do want there to be this transition over as we have certain causes. I know both of you disagree with that. But I'm just saying that oftentimes what is scary about seeing many of my friends is there is this fight, this activism when there was Trump, and now I'm afraid that with Biden people will get comfortable in a sense that they will almost forgive, excuse, forget about what Biden did in his track record. And he has a lot of things, as I was listing a few things, just of many, that it's appalling how we could think of him as being a good replacement. He is essentially just Clinton, but as a male and as another Democrat, and voting for the Iraq War. A lot of the issues that he had around equality and marriage were not necessarily the best at that time, and of course, trying to outcompete the Reagan era politics on the war on drugs, and he pushed for legislation that was trying to get as much as possible, as many people criminalized for low crime, or I don't even call it crime, but offenses, and that is how we have mass incarceration. That has had reverberations even up to the effects of it has been felt in my country, in Mexico, because the war on drugs has been one of the most, in hindsight, the most awful things that any of these the Democrat could have done during the 90s and 80s during that time, in support of that has today, to this effect, to this day, continued on. And you have people who've been torn because of families, but suddenly people are woke, like Kamala Harris saying she's okay with having done marijuana and all right with it, and she was a no nonsense prosecutor, but put many and enforced the laws of that time. I don't know. I won't go into more, but I thought maybe anyone could share. I mean, those are the most, obviously, the ones that stick out when we forget who this person is.
So I think we can see what Biden is doing now. Like, one of the things that we've seen as he's put his cabinet together is it's been about diversity and representation. We have a Latino board of Secretary of Education, Black Department of Defense, woman Department of Commerce, or something like that. I mean, various filling in certain representation boxes, and using that to make the cover of, this is our democracy, this is our anti-racism, this is our anti-sexism, and it's a complete sham, right? Having a Black Department of Defense person who basically oversaw the war in Iraq and Syria, who's basically on the board of directors of Raytheon, doesn't do anything to stop the U.S. empire. In fact, what it means is it puts either a woman's face or a Latino face or an African American person's face on the face of U.S. aggression, U.S. violence, whether that violence be gone abroad or whether it be at home. And in some ways, they're going to use race politics, right? They're going to elevate certain people of color, that they put them in these positions, and at the same time say that we're going on offensive against white supremacists. We're going after these set of white workers who are white racists and white radicals. And so this to me looks very intentional. It reminds me in some ways of the U.S. the way it would rule Iraq, right? We're going to take some minority people of Shia, put them in power, and have them rule over the Sunni. And there are elements of that I actually see on our existing government, but under the name of identity politics. And all really these identity politics are going to do is basically maintain and strengthen the rule of the capitalist class, while hiding with this representation the notion that racism and sexism and class inequality is going to grow worse in this country, and our country is going to become more brutal internally, as well as, I do believe, externally. So that is one of the things that I see in the Biden administration is there's going to be a lot of stuff around representation, a lot of stuff of maybe there'll be allowances made in certain instances for trans people in certain areas, but at the same time, it's going to be mostly a full-on attack on on workers, as Silicon Valley gets more enriched, Wall Street gets more enriched, and then this gets all covered up under representation.
So on the issue of identity politics and the most diverse cabinet ever, right? At least for me, it helps me to think of colonialism, right? And as if it's something historic in the past, but it is very much present. I feel that, in order, I actually think it's a warning sign, that to put a person of a certain marginal group in a position of power, to me, it signals that the imperial powers are ready to go to war or pacify that demographic or whatever it is. And to excuse their actions, and so to me, because of the minefield that we live in on the left, under liberal politics, it's going to be to us the black and brown and queer comrades to destroy identity politics, to question it to the roots, to understand it as a tool of the ruling class, just like racism is, because it is hard to challenge these things, and we need to think of these race, or these relations in terms of, leverage. I listened to this billionaire who was giving a speech about, people with pitchforks, and they know, if you push it enough, people are gonna fucking rise up. There will be an insurrection, and so, but he was also talking about negotiations, right? And in this system, you get where you have the ability to leverage, and we have no leverage. This is what we're talking about right now, that the working class in the US is completely decimated because there is no leverage. We're not organized, and so we're gonna have to regain control of this narrative of the racial politics, because it's out of our hands. It's completely in the hands of the ruling class. And again, it's actually, I fear, going to be used to attack our very own communities, the oppressed communities, so they can exploit everyone. Even like these symbolic things like the pipeline that Biden, fucking halted today. I don't even know the details.
Yeah.
We should be cautious. It's like DACA. When that destroyed the immigration reform movement. And in the back end there was a massive systemic, or an institutionalization of fascism, really, because they were persecuting and were able to deport 3 million people, right? If that's not fascism, then we don't understand what the fuck it is. So again, to me, it is super important that we, gain control of our own politics, and understand it in a different light, and how it's really dividing us all, and keeping us busy with playing with, fighting for crumbs.
It's interesting you both are bringing up identity politics. I agree that that identity politics is an issue. It doesn't matter what color it is. I mean, right now Biden's cabinet is made up of mostly conservative folks that were basically Obama's cabinet members, and that have had same really policies for U.S. intervention. His advisors are basically folks that want to go back to war and support U.S. intervention and proxy wars, and as well as I just think that progressives they're not going to expect much, but they are hopeful, I think, when they wish that someone like Bernie Sanders would have been placed. And we don't have any labor rights champions out there. And there is one, I think, Native American woman that was placed in there. Speaking of the pipeline, Kenny, and I forget what position, but I was listening on Democracy Now! How some of the folks at Standing Rock were very happy that she was placed in a position to be able to make some choices in the matter of pipelines. I feel her hands will be tied. I just don't think that she'll be able to make much progress, and it's unfortunate, and it's a blow to the activist communities and the environmental community. And I don't know anybody that supports the Green New Deal, which also has issues and it's problematic. But just the fact that anyone would support it, there isn't anyone in that cabinet, and as well as anti-Wall Street, So I'm in agreement with the identity politics issue, and just in general, it's just Biden is everything that we should be fighting against, I think. And I'm hoping that my friends who are liberals are watching this and they say, well, we should be rejoicing. I think we need to not forget on this day, Inauguration Day, what we all were concerned about within my circles. And suddenly we've just, it's as if, well, not for now. Or even many of our most radical circles, I would think, maybe we don't know them, but we had recently, we discussed an article, right? Or a signatory piece by some of the most people with Noam Chomsky and Andre, one of the writers that I really liked, who's an anarchist from the Bay Area, who signed this piece. I just hope that the fight doesn't, or people don't get comfortable in this administration, which is going to make it, as we're going to have a real setback in our movement.
I would also say that, I hope that, our communities, there was some level of as I agree, that was an accidental, maybe, I don't know, but Trump was able to bring more people into the fold that, they may not be as radical. I hope more people are radicalized. I do hope that our communities, our oppressed communities, don't accept that insult, that little, token of whatever inclusion is enough, that, that we somehow have something in common with Kamala Harris, with Condoleezza Rice, with Colin Powell, with or these nefarious actors. I really hope we don't insult our own intellect. That we look beyond, the limiting scope of identity politics. Because there are people that are not willing to read Marxism because they call it a white thing. And because and so it's already limiting our answers. And we keep settling for these crumbs and really have no leverage at all. And then we call whatever crumbs they give us success. And and shit is just getting worse.
I think the damage has already been done. I think Biden already has gotten plenty of accolades, not just from the mainstream media, but from all sections of the left for some sort of representation being done. So he's already accomplished. He's already won over most people who've been thinking that we're trying to we're trying to recover from Trump and move towards a better world. And even internationally, it's being talked about that way. So I don't really have that much hope that people are going to see through this. I think there are going to be maybe some people radicalized out of this, but I think the far right is going to be used as a scapegoat in the way that ISIS was used as a scapegoat, the way Al Qaeda was used as a scapegoat, the way illegal immigrants are used as a scapegoat. And I want to say to people on the far right, you were fools for ever letting this state attack immigrants or attack ISIS or attack Al Qaeda and not think they're coming after you, because now they're coming after you. All right. And the left is a fool for thinking that it helps us. All right. And the thing I would say is, I'm not worried about the left, or I'm not even thinking, oh, the left has to fight it. The left is going to cheerlead the state going after the fascists. That's what's going to happen. The left is going to cheerlead the censorship that's going to come from that. So I'm not worried about hoping that we see through this. That's done. That ship has sailed. People aren't going to see through this. All I can say is I want to see who I find over this course of this year who's willing to see through this narrative. Because as far as I can tell, it's a wrap as it relates to the left, as it relates to the public, as it relates to workers. Like, we're all falling for the COVID vaccine mask U.S. state illusion that any of this stuff is in play to either that the most frightening thing we're dealing with is COVID, and that the U.S. state is actually going to protect us from that. They've got it twisted. The most frightening thing that we are facing is the U.S. state and the corporations, the ones locking us down, the ones telling us CDC numbers, the ones telling us that we can't be around each other, because the only hope we have is not a Native American cabinet member or a Black cabinet member or a Latino cabinet member. It is the collective actions of us, the working class, internationally. That means across borders. That means people in jail. That means right-wing workers who are prepared to get armed to take on the state if we can convince them that is a collective project, right, of working class to make that kind of democracy. That is the group that's going to have to be organized to fight against this. And unless we do that, then we're going to continue to see, like, I don't have any hope about, like, people fighting, seeing through. I feel like it's already done. We're going to see who we find in the coming year.
Well, Andy, you've said a lot of things today. ISIS, and the left. I'm afraid our channel is I'm just waiting for the day we will show up with notification, and it'll be said, you do not have access anymore to this channel. Which then, remember, as I always remind folks, take down our blog's email.
Yeah, and if our channel goes down, don't blame Eduardo. He tried to warn us all. It was my fault.
So a lot of things about COVID, a lot of things about ISIS, all red flags, Andy, today.
It's your fault for not behaving enough.
I have nothing more to add to what you said, Andy. And Kenny.
We have a new president.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, God.
I find that we will have some disagreements in some future episodes, because you mentioned something, Kenny, when you talked about the pipeline. Mm-hmm. I saw that as well. And I will be cheering on some things like that. Not necessarily the president, new president, but again, I think we will have some debates in the future, the three of us, where I do think that some things I'm going to just be sort of like, okay, at least that's happening, and that's not going. We have one cause to worry about for now, but the greater cause has to still be on the journey. We still have to be on the journey for defeating the entire system. And
that's where we disagree respectfully, in the sense that we see this as a victory, when I see these things as a sign of an attack coming. That we should be watchful, that because none of this is under our terms. None of this. We have no leverage. So we kid ourselves by believing that, it's good, when in reality, it's probably an attack somewhere else. And, so that's why I'm cautious of any move that the capitalist ruling class makes, because, on the back end, and again, I use the biggest example is DACA, because it's the most obvious, that they use DACA to pacify people, and then in the back end, increase the fascist system, and that's what they're going to do in other ways. Because again, we have no way to fight back. We can always resist, is what, a lot of people have done, and I admire that, but we cannot rest for a second. If they go home, they start building again, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it'll be worth discussing because I think that another thing that took place was U.S. has now re-entered the Paris Climate Accord, and people are seeing that as a step forward.
Yeah. All right, good. Let's not forget that Monday was a day off in remembrance of Dr. Martin Luther King, and I think for many he was the sort of exemplary person we should be, but towards his later part of his life he became radicalized, and people started cutting him off left and right. Presidents wouldn't pick up his calls anymore, and people also began questioning whether he should be almost rescinding his Nobel Peace Prize because he spoke against the war, as well as he realized that it wasn't a black movement afterwards. It was a poverty issue that was happening after some time. I was listening to a speech and an interview and some context, and some writers were writing about when Dr. Martin Luther King met some white poor people. He realized then that this was a larger issue and made it more of a people's campaign against poverty. And had he, because he died very young, he was in his 30s, had he lived long enough, we wouldn't have known actually what kind of person he would have evolutionized to be in his politics, because he was starting to move away from the way that he was originally thinking. And so I think that in order for us not to dilute the history, and also I think people should look at some of his later writings and later speeches, and also people were cutting him off connections that he had, because he was a very young man. I mean, he was in his 30s. He could have, I think of Selena, how she could have, sorry, bringing up Selena, culture pop icon, but not culture in Latin American culture early, because she became an icon for Latinos. She could have grown in her success as a young person, and everyone talks about had she been allowed to just flourish, right, if she wasn't assassinated. In the same way, I think of Martin Luther King, how he could have actually given the chance. Who knows? You were going to say something, Kenya. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we brought up a little bit the issue of identity politics, and I think it's relevant to bring MLK into this, and Malcolm X, because I in my studies, at least, I think that that's why they lost their lives. That's why they were killed, because they became dangerous. Preaching identity politics is not dangerous, not at all. Now imagine those preachers reaching masses of poor people in this country, people struggling, the working class. Imagine those orators, changing their tune. And Malcolm X did the same thing when he went to Mecca. He left the blinding part of the U.S. and he came back and he changed his tune, in saying that he would organize with anybody who was against this system, and he like, again, shifted away a bit from the pure identity politics. Which I think, again, I'm not denying there was some importance to the Black community, like acts of resistance. But it just goes to show you how powerful shifting away from that, how expanding our minds beyond our own identity politics, how dangerous that is really to the establishment. And I truly believe both those powerful people lost their lives because they shifted away from identity politics.
That's an interesting take. I don't know what to make of it yet. But I appreciate you saying that. It's interesting. Today was the first time I ever heard anything around him talking to white poor people and how he was affected by that today. So I invite people, where I got that today, I invite anyone to look at KPFA Upfront, and they shared some archival correspondence of that time on the interviewed Martin Luther King on that time.
That's the thing I would say too, at least in my mind, is that MLK and Malcolm X, the sanitized version that is sold of them to us is used to pacify us, actually, and so they were more radical than they are, portrayed, even around the issue of guns. And so again, we have to take knowledge into our own hands, stop, look beyond the headlines and what we learn in academia, and take our education into, again, our own have self-determination in that end, in our own control of our own intellect, really. Like, don't wait for someone else to tell you.
Yeah. And maybe the only other MLK, because I think what I would really agree with what Kenny said about framing one of the things that made both MLK and Martin Luther King dangerous is the notion of cross-racial lines organizing. But one other thing I learned was that on the day that Martin Luther King was murdered, that there were huge demonstrations, and immediately people did think that he was murdered by the U.S. state. And I think there's evidence for that the U.S. state was complicit in his execution. So there were massive demonstrations and massive fires and riots in Washington, D.C. And what I heard was actually there were, at that time, and Congress was worried about, keeping themselves afloat, there were half the number of soldiers in Washington, D.C. under that rebellion in Washington after MLK was murdered than there were today, where supposedly 12 to 13,000 National Guard was mobilized on that day compared to the 25,000, which again to me shows that this is the state will always protect its own, but today was not about protection; it was about show of force.
And again, we think only North Korea does this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Aggressions.
Yeah.
All right. That does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode, or on our blog at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks that if you like anything you've heard here, please share your favorite episode, rate, review, turn on your notifications, subscribe to any of our 6 platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, or YouTube. And if you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts Kenny Cepeda and Andy Lipson. Thank you, and we'll see you all next time.